Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time, we talked about the youth culture of the 1960s and the environmental movement. And today, we are finishing up Unit 8, talking about how society is in a transitionary period. So, if you are ready, let's begin. First thing we're going to talk about is conservative challenges to liberal laws, court decisions, and a perceived moral culture decline. So remember, conservatives, Republicans, and they are trying to argue that essentially the power that the liberals and the Democrats had in the presidential cycles has caused America to struggle. And so conservatives are going to want to gain more power in the federal government, obviously, and they're going to want to use that power to do a few things that we need to kind of be aware of. Conservatives in this time are very big on limiting the role of the federal government, meaning they want a smaller federal government, while at the same time, they want to be more assertive with foreign policy. They felt that Democrats and liberals had been too weak in foreign policy, and they want America to take more of a leading role, thinking about the Cold War. And a lot of this comes about under Barry Goldwater's campaign for election in 1964. Okay. So he is going up against LBJ, I believe, in 1964. And he is trying to get America to think about having a smaller government. Now, Barry Goldwater does not win, but it's an influential campaign, and it kind of changes the minds and the what the conservative and the Republican Party are going to be about for the foreseeable future. And a really important speech takes place during this election. Ronald Reagan's speech called "A Time for Choosing." And this is where Ronald Reagan, who at this time was more seen as like a Hollywood actor and trying to get into his role as politics, he talks about wanting a smaller government and trying to convince people to vote for Barry Goldwater for president. And this, again, launches Ronald Reagan's political career. All right, so we talked about a little bit of this idea last time, but there is still this belief that the Democrats and the liberals aren't liberal enough by some liberal groups, okay? So the Democrats are kind of getting assaulted not only by the conservatives, but they're also getting assailed by liberals who think that they're not going far enough, that they're not doing enough to transform the racial and economic status quo at home. And what that means is that far left liberals thought that Democrats were not doing enough to support the issues that they thought were important. A major group here is the Black Panthers. We've kind of mentioned them before, but they're a civil rights organization inspired by Malcolm X. They believed in the idea of arming African Americans for self-defense, but they also did a lot of, good things for the community, like creating free breakfast programs for students in urban communities, okay? And again, in general, a lot of liberals are on the far left are criticizing this growing gap that they're starting to see between the rich and the poor, and they're thinking that Democrats in power are not doing enough to help that. So the Democrats are getting attacked by conservatives on the right, and they're getting attacked from far left liberals on the left. And then a big important trend that's going on in the 1970s is that public trust in the government is decreasing. So people are less likely to think that the government is doing a good job. And there's some reasons for that. One of them is the economic challenges that we start to see in the 1970s. And there's probably a new word here for you. So make sure you understand this vocab word, stagflation. And that is a combination of high inflation and unemployment. So inflation is when the value of money is going down because there's too much money supply in the economy. And then there's also unemployment. So stagflation is very bad. It's very worrisome. And that's what's going on in the 1970s economy. And when people's money is worth less and they're not able to get jobs, that's going to be an issue for many people. And then another huge public scandal that kind of makes people lose their trust in the government is the Watergate scandal. And this was when President Richard Nixon, who was a Republican, basically the scandal stems from Richard Nixon's administration's attempts to cover up its involvement in the 1972 break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C., at the Watergate office building. Essentially, Richard Nixon tries to cover up the idea that he had tried to get people to break in to the Democratic headquarters to figure out what their strategy was in the upcoming election. And they try to cover all that up, that they try to get people to do that. And Richard Nixon is about to be impeached and ends up resigning before he could be impeached, okay, and probably would have been impeached, but ends up resigning. And so this is a massive scandal. The president of America resigns. All right, that's a massive issue. And so it's a lot of people are, again, losing trust in the government. And then we're going to see a lot of foreign policy crises happen. Okay, we've talked about the oil embargo before from OPEC. We've talked about the Vietnam War before, so those are foreign policy crises going on. But then there's this new one I want to teach you about. It's called the Iran hostage crisis in 1979. And what this is under the president after Richard Nixon. His name is Jimmy Carter. Okay, and under Jimmy Carter, Iran, a country in the Middle East, people in Iran had taken 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. And basically, Iranian college students had done this. And those hostages, these American citizens, are held hostage in Iran for 444 days from 1979 to 1981. And Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, was not able to get them released for over a year. And this leaks into the election, the 1980 election. And it makes the Democrats and Jimmy Carter look very weak on foreign policy. It makes the government look weak in general. People are losing faith in the government. And this does lead to Ronald Reagan, Republican, winning election in 1980. We'll talk more about him in future lessons, but this is a big part of that. Okay. And again, in general, public trust is decreasing. So we've been talking a lot about politics and conservatives and liberals, and there's a lot of clashes that start to happen. And I would make sure you're aware of some of these clashes for sure so that you can explain these if this is a DBQ, an LEQ, something that gets brought up on an exam, okay? So what are they clashing over? What are Democrats and Republicans, conservatives, liberals, right? What are they all clashing over? Social and cultural issues are a big issue that they're clashing over. So there's a lot of changes that are going on to the American family. We see divorce rates going up. More women are working outside of the home. So all these changes are going to kind of increase the tension, and different groups are going to feel differently about that. There's also a lot of urban uprisings and the role of law enforcement that plays in these uprisings. People have disagreements about. There are a lot of riots after Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. And then there's these riots I wanted to teach you about called the Watts riots. And there are these race riots in Los Angeles. And it was triggered by a white police officer hitting an African-American bystander during a traffic stop. And it basically set up, there was a lot of racial tensions going on at the time in Los Angeles, and it led to 6 days of riots in LA. And there's a lot of deaths, there's a lot of injuries, $40 million worth of damage. And again, this is an example that where people are clashing over that these changes are happening and America's not ready for it, and America's social and cultural standing is decreasing. They're also clashing over the role of the federal government and how big it should be. Remember, conservatives are going to want a smaller central federal government. And they're going to be very against LBJ's Great Society from the 1960s and those ideas of having a bigger government. Continuing on, what else are conservatives and liberals clashing over? Race is a big issue. There's a Supreme Court case that we should be aware of, Bach versus the versus the University of California. And this is a Supreme Court decision that upheld the idea of affirmative action. And affirmative action basically states that it's the idea that colleges can give preferential treatment to people of different races because they are not represented at their schools. Okay. And so some people thought that this shouldn't be allowed, but that decision actually got upheld. At this time, people are still allowed to have affirmative action. But it's ruled that you couldn't have a quota system. You couldn't say, okay, well, we need this many African Americans, this many Hispanic Americans, this many white Americans. They couldn't do that. But it does say that they're allowed to have affirmative action. And again, that became a big point of argument. And then last I want to talk about is the idea of the movement for greater individual rights and people lashing back against that. And I want to bring up Phyllis Schlafly again. She's a very important person to know about. Star her, boulder, make sure we know who she is because she's a good person to think about for evidence, to think about the arguments that people were having at the time. Remember, she was a big critic of the Equal Rights Amendment, and the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, was the amendment of trying to get women a constitutional amendment that said that they were equal in the Constitution. And she argues that the ERA is going to take away women's certain benefits that women has. Okay, when she's doing this, she would often have quips like, in her speeches, she would say, this is a quote, "I'd like to thank my husband for letting me be here tonight," when she was giving speeches. And she felt that, and she tried to argue that if the ERA became a thing, that laws that prevented sexual assault or alimony, which is if you get divorced, money that goes to the person who doesn't make as much money, would be swept away. That she tried to say that women would be less likely to receive custody over children in divorce cases if the ERA was passed, that the draft would start to include women. And now the draft was a big deal at that point, right? Because the draft was one of the main criticisms people had against the Vietnam War. She tried to make claims that the ERA might create it so that there wouldn't be single sex bathrooms. Okay. So she's trying to make these arguments and it works, right? She gets people, states never actually end up ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. We don't, it's never been passed. Okay. And she does defeat the ERA. And it's really important to know how she's able to make this a wedge issue for people and convince people that they should not have the ERA in the Constitution. All right. And then the last thing for today is the rise of a movement called the evangelical movement. This is a religious movement. Evangelicals are born again Christians. They went through a personal conversion, and they're basically staunch religious advocates. But we're also going to see how these religious advocates are going to start to bring their religion into politics and use this as a way to convince people of their political mindsets. Okay. So we see a lot of political and social activism, and this is really focused on conservatives and Republicans. Okay, and this is seen as, you can make an argument that this is a big response to Roe v. Wade and the Supreme Court case that legalizes abortion. And there's a famous person pictured on the left, Jerry Falwell. He has a group called the Moral Majority. It's a political organization trying to get evangelicals together to, again, get their issues to into politics. Okay. And what are their issues? What are the things? Well, they oppose the ERA. They oppose the idea of SALT, right, which is when they're trying to decrease the nukes, right? Because they wanted a stronger foreign policy. They oppose abortion. They oppose the gay rights movement. And so these are some of the things at this time period that is going on. And they want to focus more on the family. They want to promote the idea of abstinence. So that's and sex education, basically teaching about not having sex. Okay. They're against same-sex marriage. They're pro-life, right? These are kind of the things that they're for. And they start to become very influential in politics in the late 70s and early 80s. So that is it for our notes on society and transition and for Unit 8. So thank you so much for watching. Let's go over our big ideas. Number one, what are conservatives upset about in the late 20th century? And why are they upset? Be specific. Number two, what are far left liberals mad about in the late 20th century? Why? Let's be specific. And then number three, describe the growth of the religious movements in the late 20th century and what their impact is. Again, thank you for watching. I will see you next time.